everyone. Good evening. So nutrition being a very, very important part of our lives, and especially for our kids who have developmental issues, we have with us today Roshan ma'am. She's a registered dietitian and she's associated with the SRCC Children's Hospital, which is managed by the Narayana Health. Apart from that, I have got the chance to work with her. She is also associated with the camps which are held by Dr. Anahita Hegde, rural camps. So I think once in 6 months, ma'am, you all
4 times a year.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
The
So
pediatric neurology rural camps.
yes. So these are the pediatric neurology rural camps, and we've been lucky to be a part of them. So welcome, ma'am, and over to you. Thank you for being there.
Webinar.
Okay. So to begin with, today we are going to talk about role of nutrition in children with developmental disorders and other different conditions. So to begin with, diet for autism and ADHD. So we all know that diet is one of the potential risk factors for neurodevelopmental disorders. Now I say risk factor basically because undernutrition of most of the micronutrients like folic acid, B12 are known to cause neurological deformities in the fetuses. So the child which is born with some or the other kind of neurodevelopmental disorder. Nutrition impacts the neurodevelopment, the cognition, and the behavior of the child. A lot of clinical trials have been done with dietary interventions and include elimination diets and supplementation interventions. I'm going to discuss three of these, which are very commonly used. One is the gluten-free diet or the gluten-free casein-free diet. The other one is food additives exclusion diet, and third is the oligo-antigenic diet. Starting with the gluten-free, casein-free diet, a survey in UK found more than 80% of the parents of children with ASD reported some form of dietary intervention to cope with the symptoms of ASD. 29% of these parents used GFCF diet. 20 to 29% parents reported a significant improvement on the ASD score dimensions when they followed the GFCF diet. This study findings suggested additional effect on comorbidities such as gastrointestinal symptoms, concentration, and attention. So basically, we know that people who are gluten sensitive have gastrointestinal symptoms as a major problem. So this also improves the gastrointestinal symptoms along with neurological symptoms like lack of concentration, and attention deficit. So the term GFCF refers to a diet that is free of products that contain gluten, which is a protein found in grains such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley, as well as omitting casein, which is a protein found in milk. Now, rye is a kind of a grain, because I have heard a lot of people having the misconception that rye means the rye or the mustard seeds that we use, but it is not that. Rye is a kind of grain which is common abroad, not so much, but even in our country, if you go to malls, we find rye bread. So we have to understand that even that is to be avoided. The benefit of a GFCF diet is based on the theory that children with autism may have an allergy or high sensitivity to foods containing gluten or casein. So you can call it an allergy, or you can have say it is a high sensitivity. So the idea behind the use of this diet is to reduce the symptoms and improve social and cognitive behavior and improve speech. Now you have to understand that a GFCF diet is not easy to follow. Why? Because all over the world, the wheat is a major component that is a part of our staple diet. Also, gluten is a component which is not removed from the body very easily. It takes at least 3 months to 6 months to completely get rid of gluten from the body. So in between that period, you're on a GFCF diet and you have a small bite of some gluten containing food. You're again loading your body with the gluten, and then you're going back a few steps. So it needs to be a very, very stringent or a strict diet to get rid of the gluten from your body completely. In some cases where people are very much allergic, very strongly allergic to gluten, the measures like using separate cooking equipments, containers, utensils, and even not cooking in the same area, storing food separately, not using foods that may have been prepared in a unit where other wheat products have been prepared. So it may require to be that strict. But when we are using it for a neurological problems, we do not aim at doing it so strictly. But if an individual is very highly allergic, we need to do it that way. So gluten and casein are again a very big part of our usual diet, especially in kids, where milk is considered to be like a amrit for the kids. So no mother you will see is happy to omit milk from the diet. Also, some children are very much addicted to milk and cannot do without milk. Indian cuisine uses milk in different forms, and hence it is very difficult to follow a. It is not impossible, but it is definitely difficult to tough to follow a gluten-free, casein-free diet. Also, this diet does not contain milk products as many breads and cereals that diet may be deficient in. So what basically happens is if you're omitting the milk and the gluten can be the wheat can be replaced with other grains and cereals. But when milk is supposed to be omitted, you may end up with deficiencies of certain nutrients like calcium, fiber, vitamin A, D, and B complex, and calories, because milk is a major source of these nutrients in a child's diet. So here I present a list of foods which are to be avoided in a GFCF diet. Now this is the easy part because most of us know what is to be avoided. But this is kind of a detailed, and there are certain foods you might not even realize they are having gluten in it. So wheat and any products which are made from wheat are to be strictly avoided. Wheat flour is used for making rotis, pulkas, parathas, puris, naan, bakery items. Okay, maida or refined flour is used to make pav, bread, biscuits, Maggi, burgers, and so many other refined flour products. Pastas again made with maida. Sev, sevaya or vermicelli, rava or suji, dalia, which is used to make shira, kheer, upma, is also coming from wheat. Wheat flakes, muesli, oats, ray, wheat bran, other products which are used as a ready-to-eat cereals, and these also come from the wheat. Also, other products like cornflakes, which are made in the same factory, may also get contaminated with the gluten and may not be safe to use. Bakery products like bread, biscuits, khari, butter, toast, cake, pastries, also malted drinks, which are a very common part of a child's life, where mothers like to add a spoon or two spoons of Bournvita, Horlicks, or other malted products are also contain gluten. So these need to be avoided. Food items containing gluten also have give can be found out by reading the labels. So it may say wheat, flour, refined flour, malt, starch. So these needs to be verified. So whenever you are buying a product from a shelf, you need to read the labels to find out the nutrient content or find out the ingredients that go into making of that product to see if it has any gluten in it. Malted beverages, as I mentioned earlier. Instant soups is one of the other things that we might easily miss because it is made using refined flour. Also, things like ready to make gulab jamun. So that contains maida in it and will have gluten. Desserts which are made at home or are brought from outside, like sevaya, rava kheer, shira, karanji, gujia, gulab jamuns, will all contain gluten. Coming to the casein, it is present in milk. So milk, paneer, cheese, curds, and preparations made from it like kheers and cheese added to your Italian preparations all contain shrikhand, all contain casein, which is a milk protein. So now the question is, what do I give the child, or what do I suggest when you give such a long list of things that are not to be given? The patient immediately gets taken aback. So what am I supposed to give? So there are a lot of options. They may not be very easy or very fancy, but there are definitely lots of options that we can suggest to the patient. So any grain besides wheat, oats, and rye, like rice, jowar, bajra, corn, poha, kurmura, popcorn, can be used as, and we get different kinds of popped grains like rajgira, makka. So these can be incorporated in the diet. Dals, pulses, legumes, and preparations made out of it, like besan, are allowed. All kinds of vegetables, roots, and tubers are allowed. All fruits are allowed to be eaten. Nuts and oilseeds are allowed. Oil, ghee, butter is also allowed. Some people may question the use of ghee because it may contain casein, but since we are clarifying the ghee and using it, it doesn't have much of any of the casein part in it. Sugar is allowed, jaggery is allowed. Snacks can be made used like chivda, bhel, idli, dosa, appam, and other preparations. You can also make parathas without using the wheat flour. You can use other grains, and instead of making it like a paratha, you can make it like a thepla with addition of any kind of vegetables that you prefer. So you need to modify your day-to-day recipes using the allowed options and make different preparations so as to bring variety in the diet, so as to improve the compliance of the patient to the diet. Commercial gluten-free preparations are available in the market, but if you see properly, most of them would be products which are naturally not containing any gluten preparations. For example, you will get popcorn and it will be labeled gluten-free popcorn. But now you have to be understanding enough to not fall prey to the marketing gimmicks and see which products are actually gluten-free, which are naturally gluten-free, and which, if a commercial preparation, like there may be a gluten-free atta which is made with potato flour, which is also has some sago flour in it. So if these are really and truly gluten-free products, you can buy it, but you have to be very cautious what the content of the product are. Milk can be replaced with soya or almonds or soya. You can make milk out of soya. You can make almond milk. You can use coconut milk or ground milk. So when you want to replace milk, you can use these products. Tofu can be used to replace paneer. So there are a lot of options that you can use instead of the options which are to be avoided. And you don't need to get very scared when planning a gluten-free, casein-free diet. The next type of diet used is called a food additives exclusion diet. Now, originally this was proposed as a tool for treatment of food allergies. It is also called as a Feingold diet because the scientist named Feingold had first suggested this. And he said that allergies to food additives and salicylates may be present. And he had found that salicylates found in aspirin had caused allergy to some of the patients. So this diet includes removal of artificial food colors, flavors, fragrances, preservatives, and sweeteners completely from the diet. So no artificial chemical component is used in the diet. The hypothesis is that ADHD could be influenced by either allergenic or pharmacologic mechanisms related to the levels of salicylates and salicylates-like substances. So omission of this would decrease the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in the kids. The third is the oligo-antigenic diet. So the focus here is on eliminating the high allergenic food products rather than removing the artificial additives. So we know that the commonly known the allergenic foods are cow's milk, cheese, egg, chocolates, nuts, coffee, and there is a long list of things that an individual may be allergic to. The strawberries. So the most prominent ones are omitted from the diet and slowly reintroduced to see which food actually are allergenic. This diet comes in different forms and in varied strictness. So coming to diet for children with cerebral palsy. So I know that you see a lot of these patients and many a times you have a lot of difficulties and don't know what to do about it. Everybody of us among us tries to counsel the patient relatives as per what we see in the patient, and that is a good approach to it. Children with cerebral palsy can have unique nutritional requirements due to poor growth, inadequate oral intake of food because of the difficulty in feeding and of fluids, dependence on tube feeding, and micronutrient deficiencies because their diets tend to be very one-sided. They either take one or two foods which are blenderized and passed through the tube, or liquid preparations which are easy to be fed to the child. Sometimes the child have swallowing difficulty and may not be able to take fluids at all. There is oral, motor, and swallowing dysfunction. Poor nutritional status and poor growth are reported frequently in young children with cerebral palsy, basically because of the oral motor swallowing dysfunction. Nutrition assessments are often indicated in these patient population and include attention to growth charts, physical examinations, evaluation of food diaries, and laboratory monitoring. Now, each and everything of this is important. Why? Because just looking at the weight will not give you an impact of what has happened over the last 6 months or 1 year with the child's growth. So if you plot a growth chart, you would see whether he is going down under this on the percentiles, or he is just stagnating there, and if there is a scope to improve and bring him into the higher percentiles. A food diary helps because when you ask a mother who is taking care of a patient with cerebral palsy, it is very difficult to get a proper recall from her because she is very tired, she is very harassed, and she is kind of lost, and they may be giving just one or two foods. So making them either take a recall of the food or making them write a food diary gives you an idea of 8 to 15 days. So when they come back for follow-up, you can just go through the diary, see what they are doing, and suggest corrections or changes in what they are already doing. It is very difficult for parents to follow a diet that a dietitian would make and is very idealistic diet. You cannot give an idealistic diet to these patients because they already have a lot of problems they face in a day-to-day life. So you have to modify the diet according to what the child is getting as well as what is being prepared for the family. Using the family food pot for making diet for the child is a very good option. So you just blenderize it or change the consistency of the feed to suit the child's needs, and the mother doesn't have to prepare separate food for the child, which will ease her efforts. Interventions may include diet fortification using oral supplements. So you can use protein supplements like whatever market protein supplements that you get in case the child is severely malnourished. And if you feel that whatever the diet is being fed is very, very inadequate, oral supplement can always be suggested. Calorie boosting techniques. So this means that if a child is taking food, how do you make the small portion that food he is eating maximum dense calorie and nutrient wise? So you add things like ghee, oil. Sugar is not very highly recommended for children, but if a child is very much malnourished and the calorie deficit is huge, you can use jaggery or sugar to increase the calorie intake. You can add vegetables and fruits to the feed itself and make a one bowl meal for the child so that everything goes in that one bowl that the child eats. Also, using amylase rich flour is a very good technique. So basically, amylase rich flour helps to make the viscosity of the feed lesser. It keeps it thinner. At the same time, you can have add extra or more quantity of the powder to the feed. So that way you can increase the calorie intake. Tube feeding adjustments. Many a times we see that the child may be getting inadequate quantity, that is volume of feed through the tube feeds, or that the feeds that are being made are just basic kitchen feeds which are lacking in most of the nutrients. So preparing a proper diet, suggesting ways of increasing the proteins, the vitamins in the from the kitchen, from the regular food, and making feeds which are dense but thin as to pass to the tube feed at the same time. So a dietitian can very easily do these modifications and adjustments so that the child will get maximum out of whatever feed he is taking. Vitamin and mineral supplementation may be required, and this should be done as per the pediatrician's advice. The optimum nutritional status of the child with cerebral palsy should be a priority for all kind of children, clinicians caring for this patient and does not include only the neurologist or the dietitian. Therapists like you all are seeing them day in and day out and are in a much more better position to have a talk with the mothers and understand their problems much better than the people who they see occasionally. So everybody involved in the care of the child should aim at optimizing the child's nutritional status. So this chart here signifies the how everything is related, like oral motor and swallowing dysfunction, poor nutritional status, and poor growth are reported frequently in young children with cerebral palsy and may impact detrimentally on physical and cognitive development, healthcare utilization, participation in social events, and quality of life of these children in later childhood. So you see that lifestyle factors like dietary intake and sedentary activity affects the growth, body composition, and nutritional status, which further affects the functional ability or the GMFCS, oral motor, and swallowing functions. This in turn impacts the health status, participation, quality of life, and healthcare resource usage. So, poor growth in children with cerebral palsy is very common. Poor growth and nutrition status are commonly reported in children with cerebral palsy. There is evidence to suggest that certain children with cerebral palsy are at risk of obesity. So, here you can always see an exception, particularly those children with marked spasticity and who are relatively inactive. And also, my observation is that these are the children who eat a lot of junk food. Growth in children with cerebral palsy may be related to nutritional factors, physical factors, or factors related to the brain lesion itself, which may affect the feeding of the child. Nutritional factors include inadequate dietary intake, secondary to impaired oral motor and swallowing competency, and poor nutritional status and may impact directly on growth. Nutrition supplementation by gastrostomy results in improved linear growth in children with severe cerebral palsy if it is commenced early in life. By this, I really mean is that when we use a peg feeding mode to feed the child early on, the child's growth is better. Now we check the growth in terms of the height or length of the child. So if the child is getting enough nutrition, he will not only improve in weight, but he will also grow linearly. He will grow in height. So that is a very important criteria. So with these children, it is very important to use the weight for height criteria rather than just checking the weight of the child. So we have to change our assessments and look at the weight for height of these children. It is difficult to get the height of the children, but we have to maybe try to get the length by putting the child in a supine position. Swallowing difficulties have been reported in up to 99% of children with cerebral palsy, and the majority of which exhibit in moderate to severe or profound dysphagia. So it makes very difficult to feed these children. And here is when an option of a Ryle's tube feeding, nasogastric, or a peg insertion is a very good option. Because the worse the nutritional status of the children, the more the child is prone to common infections and illnesses, more the child ends up with respiratory tract infections and problems, which can send them to a hospital. So, oromotor and swallowing problems in cerebral palsy include poor saliva control and drooling, difficulty in sucking, chewing, and swallowing, oropharyngeal aspiration, which can be a big complication. Poor saliva control has been associated with health and lifestyle impacts such as poor hygiene, reduced social acceptability, reduced social interaction and self-esteem, increased daily care of the child. The impact of oral motor impairment on feeding and swallowing has been associated with reduced dietary intake, leading to suboptimal nutritional status and requirement for tube feeding. So we come round and round again to the problem that oromotor control or impairment is what is a major problem with children with cerebral palsy, leading to nutritional malnutrition and can be rectified by using the tube feeding. Other health issues related to oral motor and swallowing problems include pulmonary complications and pneumonia associated with oropharyngeal aspiration requiring multiple hospitalization. So, lifestyle impacts on the child and family, such as extended length of meal times, are also a common finding and can affect the day-to-day life of the child as well as the caretakers. Uh, we also have to talk about the energy cost of walking in children with cerebral palsy. We know that a lot of energy is wasted. So I wanted to cite this study here, which says that this study basically compared the energy cost of walking in children with cerebral palsy and was classified at different levels of the gross motor function classification system with that in children with the typical development. So what was found was children with CP displayed a higher energy cost of walking than the typically developing children. A strong correlation was also found between the energy cost of walking and the GMFCS levels. This indicates increasing energy cost of walking with increasing severity of functional involvement and further emphasizes the importance of considering metabolic demand in determining treatment options. So, basically, what here as a dietitian I need to say is when we are dealing with children with cerebral palsy, we have to consider their cost of energy cost of walking and again do whatever we can to improve the concentration of the feeds that they are taking in terms of energy, protein, and nutrients by increasing the density of the feeds, addition of vegetables, fruits in the diet, including milk, making the diet a healthy diet by including a balanced meal, by including grains, pulses, milk products, vegetables, and all the basic five food groups into the meals of the child. So this is where I will change and talk to you about the ketogenic diet. So a ketogenic diet is a rigid, okay, before I start, let me make it clear that I'm talking about ketogenic diet for epilepsy. I'm not talking about ketogenic diet for weight loss, okay? So the ketogenic diet is a rigid, mathematically calculated, doctor supervised diet. The teams which work together, where a dietitian and the neurologist is working and seeing the patient together, have been most successful in doing the ketogenic diet and giving the best results to a child with epilepsy. So, a ketogenic diet is a high fat, low carbohydrate, normal protein intake diet. So, if you are following a ketogenic diet where you are not giving a normal protein intake, it can impact the child's growth. So, it has to be a proper dietitian supervised diet with a high fat content, low carbohydrate, but a normal protein intake. It contains 2 to 4 times as much fat as carbohydrate and protein together. Calories and liquid intake is restricted. A ketogenic diet is used as a last resort in treatment of intractable seizures in children when they cannot be controlled with medicine alone. However, ketogenic diet can be used as the first option also. Now, why is it not used? Basically, a ketogenic diet is a very time consuming, effort consuming treatment, and the efforts are on the part of the parents as well as the doctors and the dietitian. So it is not easy to make people do a ketogenic diet, but it is much easier to follow when the parents have tried all sorts of treatments and the last option available is the diet, or before a child is suggested a surgery, a surgery for epilepsy, a last try could be given to a ketogenic diet, and then the parents are easier to convince and to make follow the diet. The diet is designed to create and maintain a state of ketosis and to reduce the number and intensity of the seizures. So a comparative distribution of carbs, proteins, and fat is shown in this slide. So what does your normal diet look like? Your normal diet will have 65% of carbohydrates, 15% of proteins, and only 20% of fats. Coming to a ketogenic diet, look at how it is completely reversed. Your carbohydrate content is 4% compared to 65%. Protein is 6% compared to 15%. Now, this 6% is actually the normal requirement of the person and can range from 1 gram per kg body weight to 2 gram per kg body weight, depending on the child's requirement and the ratio that is used for the diet. Fats are a whopping 90% of the diet. We also have a modification of the ketogenic diet called the modified ketogenic diet or the modified Atkins diet, where it is a little bit more liberal than the ketogenic diet, and 64% of the calories will come from fats, 6% from carbohydrates, and 30% from proteins. Now, the very popular ketogenic diet, which is used for weight loss, follows something like this. So basically, the weight loss ketogenic diet is based on the modified Atkins diet. So how do we select the patient? Patient selection is done very properly. It is strongly recommended in a child who has failed 2 to 3 anticonvulsants. It is a treatment of choice in certain disorders, certain types of epilepsies. It should be initiated regardless of age and gender. There is no contraindication for age or gender for a ketogenic diet. It is offered earlier on in certain epilepsy syndromes like infantile spasm, which do very well with a ketogenic diet. So in infantile spasms, after the ACTH has been tried, the next option is usually the ketogenic diet. Contradictions should be ruled out before starting a patient on a ketogenic diet. So what are the indications or what are the conditions that are suggested for following the ketogenic diet and the contraindications? So there's a huge list. So the probable benefit which is being shown is in GLUT1 deficiency, pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency, myoclonic aesthetic epilepsy, tuberous sclerosis complex, Rett syndrome, severe myoclonic epilepsy. So there's a long list. You can just go through it. Whereas it is contradicted in many conditions, and most of them are conditions where the fatty acid metabolism is affected. You cannot give a ketogenic diet to a child who is having fatty acid metabolism defect because he will not be able to handle all that fat. So certain conditions like carnitine deficiency, carnitine translocase deficiency, beta oxidation defects are contraindicated for a ketogenic diet, and we have to be very clear about this before we start the diet. So we have been doing the ketogenic diet at the Keto Kid project since last 10 years, and this is the protocol that we are following. So visit 1 includes a detailed neurological history along with the examination of the patient. The diet is explained and the parents are counseled about the requirements of the ketogenic diet. What do they need to buy? What do they need to do? How strict it is? What is expected out of them? Then they are advised investigations to the baseline metabolic state. All it's the regular blood test, including the liver profile test, the renal profile test, the bicarb levels, the thyroid levels, the basic blood protocol. Besides the sonography to see if there are already any stones, renal stones present, because ketogenic diet is known to cause stones in the child. So a baseline investigation is done. A baseline EEG is done so that it can be compared after a few months how it has affected the child. Visit 2 includes a session where all the equipment that have been asked to be purchased are checked by the dietitian. Again, counseling of the diet is done. How the urine ketone monitoring has to be done is taught to the relatives or the caretakers. How to maintain a seizure diary. And this is when they are counseled about starting the carbohydrate washout diet. Then a third visit includes where a majority of the patients are started on a ketogenic diet ratio of 2:1 on an outpatient basis. So there was a time when it was done inpatient, the patient needed hospitalization, but we have been doing this on an OPD basis. Except where children are in status epilepticus and are already in the intensive care unit, and for neonates and infants because there is higher risk of going into hypoglycemia. The subsequent follow-up visits are initially at 3 to 4 visits are scheduled at a monthly intervals. Later, visits are recommended at 3 monthly intervals. Visits are also updated through telephone and internet communication for patients who are overseas and outstation. So this is the protocol of the ketogenic diet. The pre-diet evaluation and counseling, this is the detail of what I already said. So first we do the counseling, then the nutritional evaluation of the baseline weight, height, ideal body weight, BMI, the diet recall to understand the diet history of the patient is done, laboratory investigations are done, ancillary testing like EEG, MRI may be done. When all these reports are available, we do the pre-diet evaluation where we have or we inform the parents and to counsel them to have realistic goals. We do not make them think that the diet is going to completely cure the epilepsy and the seizures are going to come down to zero. We also have to understand the parental expectations because once the seizures start reducing, then the parents expect that the child should just start walking, talking, and running like a normal child, which may not always be possible or available. Rule out contraindications and evaluate for complicating factors. Discuss psychosocial issues of the patients. We see a lot of people who come to us which are having a lot of financial difficulties and have difficulty following the diet. So when we are planning diet for them, either we assist them in starting the diet and the recipes and all that are required are made using minimum things that need to be commercially prepared and brought. We use the home products that are available in the house. We have to give a minimum of 3 to 6 months just to understand whether the ketogenic diet is working or not. It is not an overnight thing. So the diet initiation is the first step. So we have this thing about whether diet should be done in a hospital where the child is fasted or whether we use the carbohydrate washout method like our unit is measuring following. So the John Hopkins protocol. So this is the protocol where it originated, and everybody is following a different form of the John Hopkins protocol. So here what they did was they used fasting for a period of 24 to 36 hours or till the child comes 4 plus urine ketosis. Now the child is hospitalized so that his blood glucose can be monitored and hypoglycemia can be avoided if it occurs. Then a 4:1 ratio ketogenic eggnog is slowly introduced over a period of 3 days until 4 plus urine ketosis is achieved. So the child is kept fasting till the urine ketone come 4 plus. Then 1/3 portion of the regular ketogenic eggnog meal is started on day 1. 2/3 is started on the day 2, and the full meal is started on day 3. After which the child the relatives are properly counseled and then discharged. A regular 4:2 ketogenic diet is later made into 3 meals per day. So that is the John Hopkins protocol. So what do we do here? We basically start with the carbohydrate washout. So this diet is followed for a period of 5 days on an OPD basis and does not require any hospitalization. All foods containing the carbohydrates like sugar, jaggery, cereals, pulses, fruits, vegetables, milk and milk products are avoided. So what is left to be eaten? Foods allowed per day are 200 ml of regular cow's milk, 1 tomato, 1 onion, 25 gram paneer or cheese, and unlimited quantities of egg, fish, chicken, meat, and soy products like soya rava, soya granules, soya powder, soya milk, tofu. Now, since this diet uses a lot of non-vegetarian foods and soya products, it becomes very difficult for vegetarians to follow the diet. It is possible, and people are doing exceptionally well with a vegetarian ketogenic diet, but the varieties that you can give get limited. So your sample carbohydrate washout diet plan would look something like this. You start early morning with a glass of soya milk. Breakfast can be an egg omelette or a soya rava upma, where you add soya rava, oil, tomato, onion, chili powder. Mid-morning could be almond or walnut, just 1 or 2 in number. Lunch is a soya khichdi, again which will be similar to your soya rava except for the texture because you will be using soya granules. Tea time could be soya milk. Evening is a sugar-free jelly made by using gelatin, food color, a flavor and an artificial sweetener. Dinner could be paneer and soya, or a egg pulao or a paneer pulao, where you use egg or soya granules, chili, garlic paste, and all the masalas that you want to eat. Bedtime could be iced cream using a artificial sweetener or soya milk. So you might also be wondering where to get all these products. So we have several vendors who provide these products, and our patients are given the contact of these people and they procure it from them. So when you start the ketogenic diet after 5 days of the washout, on the sixth day onwards, 3 to 4 equally distributed ketogenic meals are allowed through the day. All meals will have the same amount of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. A 2:1 ketogenic diet is started. Now, the John Hopkins protocol uses 4:1 ratio, but we have observed that, as it is always told by Dr. Nathan also, that the Indian or the Asian population have a higher fat in the body. Genetically, we are made that way. So, it is easier to get ketones at a lower ratio of fat and carbohydrate and protein. So, a 2:1 or 2.5 or maximum 3:1 ratio is what we usually need to use for our patients. So we start with a 2:1 ratio and slowly we fine tune, and in subsequent visits, if required, the ratio is increased to 2.5 or 3:1. Some patients may require 4:1, and it depends from patient to patient. So the ratio of the meals will vary from 2:1 to 4:1 depending on the patient's urine ketone monitoring reports. So you might find this a little bit confusing, but dietitians would understand this. So this is how we do the calculation for the diet. A calorie intake is approximately 75% of the RDA for the child's age and expected body, because we are not expecting a very rapid increase in weight of the child, neither are we going to allow any weight loss. This is required because it is very difficult to get 4 plus ketosis and have weight gain both at the same time. So there will be steady increase in weight, and so calories are restricted. In case we find that the child is having weight loss at the subsequent follow-up, we increase the calories by 100 at one time. So 100 calories are increased, and still the weight loss is happening, we further increase the calories. The expected body weight is based on the 50th centile for the age, based on which all the calculations are made. Liquids or fluids are calculated at 1 ml per kilocalorie. It may be less or more depending on the climatic condition. So in the monsoons, we might need lesser fluids, but in summer, the volume of fluids is increased. If the child is constipating, we tell them to increase the fluids. The diet must include minimum 1 gram of protein per kg body weight to accommodate the growth of the child. The diet is started at 2:1 ratio and later fine-tuned as per the requirement. Calcium and multivitamin supplements are prescribed because this is not a well-balanced nutritional diet. So it is mandatory that we give calcium and multivitamin supplements to all our patients. These are given in a non-sugar form. So no sugar containing syrups or sugar-coated tablets or dispersible tablets are allowed. All the medications and supplements have to be in an uncoated sugar-free form. So this is a sample ketogenic diet. Now I've given a comparison of the 2:1 ratio to a 4:1 ratio. For example, a 6-year-old child weighing 18 kgs and is on a 2:1 ratio diet with 4 meals per day. The calories are 1200. The fat that is allowed in the diet is 109 grams, whereas protein is 22 grams to match with his weight. Carbohydrates is 32 grams. Now compare this with a diet of 952 calories with a 4:1 ratio. The fat is 95. It may look lesser than what is there in the 2:1 ratio, but look at the carbs. There you are giving 32 grams of carbs. Here it is only 9.8 or 10 grams of carb allowance which is available, and we are giving 14 grams of protein, that is 1 gram per kg body weight. So the carbohydrate content will drastically reduce as the ratio increases. For example, a recipe, like if you're making a fruit cream recipe, 100 gram cream, fruit A would be something like an apple, 48 grams, soya powder 8 grams, and 4 grams oil is what will give. Now here you will see that okay, there's only 4 grams of oil, but majority of the oil will come from the cream. And hence when we are planning recipes, dietitians have to understand that they should use items or ingredients where there is hidden fat, so that the recipe is more palatable, and you do not have to give a food to the patient where there is layer and layer of oil and the food is completely unpalatable. So planning the recipes in such a way that the oil is not very visible is a very good option to make it acceptable. So supplementation recommended. Universal recommendations are multivitamin with minerals, calcium with vitamin D. Optional extra supplement like the polycitra or oral citrates are given for patients who are either already having a urine stone, renal stone, or those who are on Topamac, because Topamac is known to cause renal stones, as well as a ketogenic diet is causes stones. So these patients are mandatory on oral citrates to keep their urine diluted and to flush out any stones that could be formed. Laxatives may be used if the child is constipating, but this would also be sugar-free formula like a glycerin suppository may also be used in case instead of a oral laxative. Additional selenium, magnesium, zinc, phosphorus, vitamin D may be given as per requirement. Carnitine is usually prescribed for all the patients, mostly those who are on valparin, because valparin tends to increase the ammonia levels and carnitine helps to decrease it. MCT oil or coconut oil may be used. We in our protocol use flaxseed oil as a source of omega fatty acid. So 1 teaspoon of flaxseed oil is added to any of the meals, and this is extra beyond the calculations. Salt may be used, it is allowed to be used in all the preparations. So all these supplements will have to be in a carbohydrate-free preparation. So what are the common problems in that you would face when you are putting a child on a ketogenic diet? First is hunger. The physical quantity or volume of the food is very small compared to the normal food that you would give the child. So when you have been giving a full plate of food to the child, it will come down to a one small bowl, and that could make the child hungry during the initial period. But as soon as the ketones start forming, the appetite goes down. So this body's natural way that ketosis induces lesser hunger in the child. Child could be thirsty, and you may need to increase the volume of fluid that is allowed. Drowsiness is most likely due to an elevated level of medications in the blood, because it is seen that ketogenesis tends to make the drugs more active or more potent. The concentration may increase, and these will need to be adjusted, and that is why it is very essential that consultations are done with the dietitian and the neurologist together. Constipation is one of the very common form of problem that the children face because of the small volume of the food and the high concentration of fat. So then we advise them to give or select recipes which have more amount of vegetable in it. We also increase the fluids, and if required, a suppository may be advised. Now, what is the effect? So after doing all this, what are you expecting out of the ketogenic diet? So significant seizure control. So this is a presentation of the patient that we have seen till now. It was more than 180 patients. So this a survey was done, and we have accumulated all the data, and it showed that significant seizure control was noted among all categories of diagnosis. So different kind of diagnosis showed some or other form of seizure control. No association was seen between the age of onset and the seizure control, or that is the time when we start the diet. The age may be anything from a few months to few years, but the seizure control was same. Consistent ketosis was noted among the earlier age groups in significant manner. So the younger children showed a better seizure control or better ketosis. No significant association with time taken to achieve consistent ketosis was seen. There was no association with ratio of the ketogenic diet with seizure control and time taken to achieve the seizure control. There was a significant decrease in number of anti-epileptic drugs after onset of the diet. So this was a very big positive, because anti-epileptic drugs cause a lot of problem for parents who are not affording, or even who are affording, because they cost a bomb. And if we can reduce a few of the anti-epileptic drugs, it helps the caretakers. What are the other benefits of ketogenic diet? The other benefits that were noted were in the form of improved behavior in 40% of our cases, improved alertness, 64.6% of our cases. And the secondary benefit of these two is restarting school. Now you all must be wondering, why have I put that picture of a child looking at those cookies or donuts? I don't know what it is. So basically, as the behavior improves, alertness improves, the understanding of the child improves, it becomes much more difficult to follow the ketogenic diet, because the child understands and demands what he wants to eat. He wants to eat all kinds of stuff that the other family members are eating. He wants to have a normal diet, and this is when it becomes very difficult to have compliance to the ketogenic diet. So the benefits also have some side effects. So in conclusion, ketogenic diet is a safe and effective therapy for intractable childhood epilepsy in children. It provides a significant evidence of seizure control and reduction of anti-epileptic drug burden. Behavior and cognition benefits of the diet on the children is noteworthy. It is very well tolerated in a pediatric population. So basically, we have to be very realistic as to what we are expecting from this diet. What is of priority for the parents? The child may still be getting seizures, but he is improved drastically when it comes to cognition and understanding and his motor control. And maybe that is what you should aim for. You do not aim for complete seizure control and be very strict with the diet, and it becomes very difficult at that time. So we have to understand the priorities of the parents when we are following the diet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a few questions, so Dr. Arya will be taking them up.
Yeah. Uh, Good evening, ma'am. So, starting with the questions. So, the first question is, should we follow a CFGF diet for all ASD and ADHD kids, or test them for its allergy and then follow it?
Yeah, so it is not very easy to test the children for allergies, because when you do an allergy test, you will find that the child is coming positive for a lot of different things. So the best way is to start by omitting sugar and the other additives in the diet, and then you can go a step ahead and maybe stop very prominent sources of gluten in the diet, and then just observe whether it is affecting the child. It is not mandatory for all the patients to follow a CF diet, because we do not know if it is going to really help them majorly. So doing an allergy test before that is not very advisable, because you might not get any conclusive findings out of it, and you'll be ending up just making the child restrict all kinds of other foods.
Okay. So the next question is, do all gluten sensitive or allergic children have autism or ADHD features?
No, not necessarily. I am one myself. I am a gluten sensitive person, but my symptoms are more digestive tract. So gluten sensitivity usually comes or shows in the form of digestive problems. It can be neurological. Weight loss is one of the very first symptoms that children see. It can also be skin related symptoms, but no, all gluten sensitive children are not, people are not ADHD.
Okay. So, ma'am, is there any test we need to do to find out if we are gluten and casein sensitive?
Yeah, so casein sensitive, I am not aware of the test. You normally need to do a stool test, reducing sugars. But gluten, you do a transaminase test, which is done in lab, so and can be done to find out if you are a gluten sensitive person. It is not a very difficult test, so can be done. But you can always do the easier way is to just go by the symptoms. So what can be done is for a period of 1 month, or if you are comfortable enough, 3 months, omit the foods that you feel are causing you any kind of allergy, maybe gluten, casein, milk, whatever, and slowly introduce one thing at a time. When you introduce the food which you are allergic to, and if you have abstained from it for a long period of time, you will see the symptoms very prominently and very fast. And so if you see the symptoms, you can very easily say that, okay, I'm allergic to this product, I'm better off avoiding it.
Okay. So, ma'am, in small children, how do they identify? Is it the same as you mentioned now, gluten sensitivity?
Yeah, so they do the tissue transglutaminase test, and then they will get the reports.
And suppose the kid
Sometimes,
is positive.
but then, sorry to interrupt, but basically, if there is a gluten sensitivity, it is usually confirmed by a biopsy. An intestinal biopsy is done to confirm gluten sensitivity. Only after that, even if you have done an allergic test, it is not confirmatory.
Okay. So, ma'am, in case the child is positive for it or is known to be sensitive, whom do we refer to? A nutritionist initially, or the doctor, or how should we go about it?
See, it is depends on the symptoms. If the child is having a digestive symptoms, most of the time the child will get referred from the gastroenterologist to the dietitian. But if you have observed and if you're sure that it is a gluten sensitive and you are ready to follow the restrictions, you can straight away go to the dietitian. But if it has neurological symptoms, it is very difficult to decipher whether it is because of the gluten or some underlying neurological problem. So you would definitely want to go to a neurologist before you come to a dietitian. But if you are following a GFCF diet or any kind of a diet, you do it under the supervision of a dietitian who will make sure that the child is getting, or an adult is getting, all the nutrients side by side when she is restricting so many of the foods.
Yeah. So, ma'am, can curd or yogurt substitute milk?
Curd and yogurt can substitute milk if you are not allergic to any of the milk products. Like the two type of allergies or insensitivities in milk come from the lactose, that is the sugar present in the milk, and the casein, which is the protein. So curd will have both of it, or any milk product will have both of it. So it doesn't make any sense of substituting milk with curd.
Okay. So the ma'am, next question is carbohydrate and protein intake different in children with cerebral palsy from a normal child, and how to adjust it along with the ongoing therapy needs? So the following question to that is, what things to be added and subtracted in these children specific to therapy needs and weaning from breastfeeding? I mean, do they wean off similar to normal children, or they have like some different norms, or they take time?
Okay, to start with, there is no carbohydrate restriction as such mentioned for the children with cerebral palsy. You just have to make sure that the child gets adequate nutrition. Now, coming to know how to make that adequate or make his feeds adequate, I would also like to start with what you've asked about breastfeeding and weaning. So basically, what is weaning? Weaning is getting the child started on oral feeding, like he takes normal food other than mother's milk with the mouth. How do you do that? You slowly increase or change the consistency of the feed. You first start with a feed which is similar to the milk, so that the child gets used to eating or drinking it. Once he's mastered that, you would go ahead and make something like a rice moong dal powder kanji, or a khimti, what you call in Marathi, or a porridge, which is smooth in consistency and texture, so that the grainy products do not get stuck. And this I'm talking even for a normal child, and the same applies even for a child with cerebral palsy. So the grainy products, the child is not used to eating it and may try to vomit out. But slowly over the period of time, if you make the consistency from smooth to slightly grainy to more coarse, and over the period of time, you wean the child to a normal family pot. So if a child with cerebral palsy is not having too much of difficulty in chewing and swallowing, you can graduate him in the weaning process like a normal child. But if your child is having difficulties, then definitely considering the difficulty level, you have to go across with the weaning, or you might have to stick with blenderized feeds. Now, a normal child, you would always suggest that do not give blenderized feeds to the children. Let them chew, let them understand to chew, let them understand the texture, introduce different textures. But for a child with cerebral palsy who is having feeding difficulty, you cannot insist on that. Then you suggest that you blenderize the feed in a mixie so that it is smooth to eat, so that the child has minimum reflux, minimum gagging, and he can eat the food easily. So basically, your weaning will depend on the child's capacity to eat. Does that answer you?
Arya, are you there? Arya? Ma'am, I think she got disconnected.
Okay.
Do we stop here, or there are a few more questions, but we are already...
Ma'am, I had one question. What about the pregnant ladies? If they are taking medicines, okay? So for the seizures, so what should we start with them? Should we start with keto or a low carb? And which
Ketogenic diet
medicine?
for pregnant ladies is not completely avoided. You can sustain a person on a ketogenic diet, but then again, it will depend on. See, it will again depend from case to case. It would be depending on the lady's other parameters, whether she is gaining enough or not. So it will be a very closely monitored. So you cannot just use the same principles that you use for a regular ketogenic diet to a woman who is pregnant. Maybe there we'll need to put her on a lower ratio. We need to increase her calories. We need to make sure that she gets all the nutrients. Okay. So it is not contraindicated as such, but it would be a very tough case to manage.
Yeah, ma'am. So shall we continue with the questions, or we would like to mail you the remaining questions since we are running with the time?
Yeah, it depends on you people.
Purvi, ma'am?
Arya, if there are any important questions, you can take them up. Rest we can email ma'am.
Okay. Ma'am, just the difference between the gluten-free diet and ketogenic diet.
Difference. Gluten-free diet and casein-free diet are completely different. Gluten-free diet is a diet where you remove the protein gluten from the diet, which comes from certain foods like wheat, oats, rye, and bran. We are not changing the metabolism of the child. We are not changing the construction of the diet like a high-fat, low-carb diet. Whereas ketogenic diet is a diet where you're completely changing the metabolism of the body. You're giving the body more fat to metabolize. You're restricting the sugar that will be made in the body by restricting the carbohydrates. So there is no comparison between a gluten-free diet and a ketogenic diet. They both are completely different entities.
Okay. So now, ma'am, weight loss, is modified keto diet safe or not? Like, so is it safe?
So a lot of people are following ketogenic diet for weight loss. It is safe only if it is done under proper supervision, because as I said, like we see a lot of cases coming to people who are dietitians who are doing adult weight loss therapy, and we see that people just follow something out of the internet, and then they land up with lot of deficiencies, lot of other complications, and it is a mess. So yes, you can use ketogenic diet, but it has to be done under proper supervision, where you know your blood parameters at the beginning of it, you know your lipid profiles, you follow up with the lipid profile reports after you have started the diet, and you also don't end up with any complications. So it has to be a very supervised diet, and it has to be for a short period of diet. It is not safe to follow a ketogenic diet for weight loss over unrestricted amount of time.
So, ma'am, the question is regarding pregnant ladies. So, which medications are contraindications for pregnant ladies with seizure? Before
I think this was done. I think this was
And this
taken
will
up.
be for the neurologist to answer, not me.
Okay. Yeah. So, Ma'am, just the last question. Would you like to just give a brief on, what should we do for kids with autism and ADHD? Like, there are many myths about, they should follow the gluten-free diet or they will, have a better effect on the behavior. So, with your experience, what do you think on this?
For children with autism, I have seen that restricting sugar is something that really works. So when I say sugar, you restrict sugar, jaggery, or anything that is made using these products. You also restrict preparations made out of refined flour or maida, bakery products. So simple sugars is what we say. So these definitely help with ADHD and autism. Also, GFCF diet may work in some cases where it is done very strictly and followed properly, but it may not work for many others just because it is very difficult to comply to. So if you're not able to comply, there's no sense in making people go on a GFCF diet where they eat half the products they like and half the products are restricted. Then it's just wasting time and efforts and resources.
Okay. Thank you very much, ma'am, for taking all our questions and solving our doubts. This was really very helpful for us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for
Thank you, Purva.
coming here.
Thank you so much.
It was really insightful. We were in fact getting a lot of messages from people during the session that it was really nice.
Thank you. Your feedback is very important.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.